So this is 1 Corinthians 6, the scripture for March 11th. So Paul continues in this chapter his argument from chapter 5, but goes on a short, what seems to be a tangent, at least at first. It's related to some of his thought about judgment. Now, because Jesus Christ is the ultimate judge, I think is how Paul's thought goes, and since we're called to imitate Christ, we too should know what we're doing when somebody comes to us to render a judgment, or for us to render a judgment on their behalf. We need to be able to render fair and just judgments, because if the church can't render fair and just judgments, then what hope do we have of ever really getting fair calls as far as what ought to be the case? If we as Christians don't have the strength to speak truly and rightly, who's going to do it? When I was in elementary or middle school, there was a situation at the church I was growing up in. There was a young man who had been killed, actually, by a drunk driver. It was a horrible situation in so many different ways, with the grief and the mourning of the family. But what made it worse is that the family decided that they didn't get compensated enough from their insurance company. And their insurance agent was also a member of the church. And so the family took this agent to court. And it was just a terrible situation, both through the grief, but also through this lawsuit, which really just fractured the church. And people started taking sides, and it was a big deal. And I think that we experience quite deeply the truth of Paul's instruction in verses 7 and 8, that we should be above this. We shouldn't have to take one another to court, because we should be able, as Christians, to render right judgments. And if we're not able to do that, we're not doing our job right. Another word about verses 9 and 10. If Paul's argument through chapters 5 and 6 is designed to protect sex and to protect worship, particularly idol worship, from striking against love of God and love of neighbor, then we need to investigate Paul's list of vices here contextually. Because if that's his sort of ultimate purpose in these chapters, then each of these vices, each of these 10 practices are going to be about either not loving God or not loving neighbors. And I want to specifically sit with what my Bible translates male prostitutes and sodomites. These are numbers 4 and 5 on this list. So male prostitutes and sodomites possibly refer to the Roman practice of pederasty. And this is a practice in which an older man would take a younger boy under his wing, a teen or preteen, as a protege. And this younger boy would learn from the older man all the ins and outs of culture, history, philosophy, how to be part of the community. Whereas the older man, in addition to getting the privilege of being able to instruct this younger boy, would also get sexual favors from him. And so the two words that Paul uses here in the Greek refer to this practice, refer to the older man in this practice, the mentor, along with the protege, the younger man in this practice. And there was also a practice of male prostitution at pagan temples. And so this seems to be, one of these things seems to be what Paul's referring to here. And there are a number of people who would take this set of vices from 1 Corinthians 6 and use a couple of them to apply to same-sex relationships or same-sex marriages. And I just don't think that translates very well. What Paul's talking about here isn't a relationship of equality of power where people have committed to one another to partner with one another for their entire lives. It's a relationship where an older man is taking advantage of a younger boy. And this was unconscionable to Paul. It's both idolatry to some degree, because it's you're lifting sex up on a pedestal, but it's also abusive, and it's abusive of neighbor. And so I think that when we look at the practice of same-sex relationships as we understand them in our modern day, we cannot read what Paul's saying here anyway as being either in favor or against same-sex relationships. That just wasn't something Paul would comment on. It wasn't part of his context. But Paul is clear that sexual intimacy is as deep a commitment as marriage. And so if you think, well, I should probably try and see if the sex is any good before I decide to sign my life away and to commit in marriage, that's kind of getting it backwards. It's because sex in some mystical, spiritual way is marriage to some degree. Where, as Paul says, if you lie with somebody, you're one with them in body. That this is what was meant when God said at the beginning, the two shall become one flesh. So I think one of the things Paul's trying to convey to us here, don't cheapen sex, because in doing so you cheapen your own body, and your body is a temple, God's temple. In light of 1 Corinthians 6, how can you offer correct judgment today? That's all for 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Tomorrow, March 12th, we'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.